Good evening from Washington, D.C. I am Julia Chang Bloch, founding president of the U.S.-China Education Trust, or USCET. I am delighted today to open the third in the series of USCET's Asian Women Trailblazers series, launched last year to address the surge in anti-Asian hate that has put the lives of Asian American Pacific Islanders, or AAPIs, at risk across the country. USCET launched the series to confront Asian Americans' history of exclusion and invisibility, and to raise awareness of Asian contributions to American culture and society, that AAPIs are part of the narrative of America. Journalists are at the front lines of getting the truth out to the public. We're proud to present on our panel today some of the best of AAPI journalists who are reframing how the US media portrays the AAPI community, speaking out against discrimination, racism, and injustice against AAPIs as never before. Most of us, I think, remember the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II only as history. But I am old enough to remember viscerally the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982. His killers would never spend a full day in jail. Helen Zia, one of our speakers today, will tell you how Vincent Chin's family never got the justice they deserved. And my question to everyone today is whether that can happen again. All of us here today should remember the Atlanta shootings that killed 8 people, 6 of them Asian American women. March 16th, 2021 was just last year. The killings could happen in 2021 because the killers of Vincent Chin got away with it. The recent surge in anti-Asian hate is the long legacy of anti-Asian violence in America. Do we know what has happened to the Atlanta killer? Do we have the full story on Michelle Go, the Chinese American woman pushed to death in front of a New York City subway train? I will leave that to the speakers to tell us whether justice will be done or not. If Asian Americans will have justice, it will be in part because AAPI journalists, like those we have on our panel today, have raised their voices and visibility to speak to truth. Before I turn the mic to Grace Yu, Vice Chair of the 1990 Institute, let me thank her and the Institute for joining us in common cause to address racism and anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese hate that has deepened with the growing tensions in US-China relations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, let me thank the Pauline Tsui Family Foundation for making this series possible. Pauline herself was a trailblazer, founding the Organization of Chinese American Women, the first national AAPI organization dedicated to leadership development of Chinese women in community and public service. This 4-part series honors her memory. Thank you all very much. Grace, it's all yours.
Thank you, Julia. We are very happy at the 1990 Institute to be hosting or co-hosting this webinar with USCET. This is indeed a very important work, and there's so much more to do. And again, my name is Grace Yu. I'm the Vice Chair of the 1990 Institute. And at the Institute, our mission is a dual one, to promote the fair and equitable treatment of Asian Americans and a rational relationship between the US and China. At 1990 Institute, we kind of recognized a few years ago that the changing relationship between the US and China is going to bring some challenges. And with the resurgence of anti-Asian hate, the 1990 Institute redesigned our programs and also launched some new initiatives. One of the new programs that we have designed is an Instagram project called the New Asian American Voices. And it's a platform that we use to highlight Asian Americans' contribution and their achievements to counter the stereotypes of Asian Americans in anti-Asian hate. The journalists that we have, they are our eyes and ears to the society. And through their works, we stay in touch and find out what is happening around us. For Asian American journalists, there is often added expectation that they should champion for and report on the issues related to AAPI communities. We have convened a panel of distinguished Asian American journalists today to share their trials and tribulations of being a pioneer Asian American journalist and their frank discussions on reporting on AAPI issues and all the challenges that we have ahead of us. And I would like to introduce our moderator, Mei Fong, of today's webinar. She's a trailblazer herself, being the first Malaysian Chinese American to earn a shared Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on China. She's also the author of One Child, the story of China's most radical experiment, which won a 2006 Human Rights Press Award from Amnesty International and the Hong Kong Correspondents Club. Mei is currently the Chief Communication Officer of Human Rights Watch and the advisor to the 1990 Institute. Here's Mei to get the conversation started.
Thank you so much. It's truly my honor to be able to introduce our speakers tonight. Starting first with Helen Zia, who is, I think, as was mentioned before, author, activist, and I think for those of you who maybe don't know, was, I think, very instrumental in the coverage of Vincent Chin, who was an auto worker who was killed, and his perpetrators were not brought to justice, and was seen as a real turning point for the Asian American civil rights movement, and Helen was really instrumental in that. I also know Helen very much from her work covering the intersection between U.S. and China, particularly from issues such as the cause of Wen Ho Lee, the Los Alamos scientist who was falsely accused as a spy, and in addition to Helen, there's Joey Chen, who is a faculty member at Poynter and an award-winning journalist. By the way, you're going to hear the words award-winning journalist many times here because they are all award-winning journalists. One of the first and few, unfortunately, still Asian anchors that we've seen on major networks, CNN, CBS, Al Jazeera. Joey has won Emmy and Loeb awards, and really, although she's very modest, really been a real trailblazer. And last but definitely not least is Wei Jiajiang, senior White House correspondent for CBS. Wei Jia as a very seasoned journalist. Again, you're going to hear the words award-winning journalist, but I think most of us might most recently know her best from her coverage of the Trump years, where the issues and intersection of Trump's depiction of the coronavirus as a Chinese virus and his treatment of women journalists of color, was particularly met in this nexus and this clash that Wei Jia had to, it was a particularly challenging time that Wei Jia met with a lot of grace and professionalism. So welcome everyone. I guess I'm going to start first with a little bit of what I would call a softball question, but which is, what does the term trailblazer mean to you? If trailblazing means, exposing, breaking new paths, are we still trailblazing today? Are we still in an age where it's somehow rare or difficult for an Asian American woman to be a journalist, to cover these issues? What are the new challenges? Maybe I'll start first with Helen. Helen, what does trailblazer mean to you?
Well, thank you, Mei Fong. And I just want to say just how, what an honor it is to be here with such a distinguished fellow journalists. And as part of this USCET and 1990 Institute program. You know, May, you gave the definition, blazing new trails, being in places, but, and you ask, are we still doing that? And I have to say, when I look at Joey and Weijia and you, we are of different times, even though every one of us is under 30. But we have all been in places where we have, where there haven't been people like us, who look like us. And it's still happening. There are still tables, there are still rooms, there are still businesses, there are still corporate, C-suites, and not even corporate C-suites, still mailrooms, still, people in places and jobs that Asian Americans and Asian American women have not been welcomed or even part of. So every time there is an Asian American woman in one of those places, she can be a trailblazer. And why I say can be, it's not enough just to be there. It's also, what do you do with it? Because when you're blazing a trail, it means, there's a possibility of people coming behind you. So if you are in a place like that, do you open the door a little bit, or the window, or somehow make it possible for people to come behind? And to me, that is what a trailblazer is. And I know that you and Joey and Weijia and others have been doing this. So that's the key, actually blazing a path, not just being there.
Well, that's a great way of putting it. I was reminded of what you're saying today in a separate context, because they ran the obituary for Andre Leon Talley, who was a major force of fashion and one of the very few Black faces in fashion. And many of the obituaries said, unfortunately, it seemed like he was one and only. There was very little opening of doors in that respect. And so I think you touched upon a very important point here, not only the importance of just finding a way for yourself, but making a way for others. But Joey, you were particularly modest about this when we were having a pre-discussion on, and I thought that what you mused about the difference between what was trailblazing then and now was particularly interesting. You talked in particularly about I think you and Helen both discussed the idea of what was trailblazing then may not be quite the case now. That the ability to sort of, when I think Helen
make change, I think May is really, to what Helen was saying. First of all, I think that Helen and Weijia are clearly trailblazers in that sense. It's not false modesty. I really do think I was just, in many ways, never did enough with the power that I had as an AAPI, and maybe we'll reflect on that later. But I do want to take a moment to think about how that term, that trailblazing, has changed, and particularly in this week. I cannot tell you how brilliant I think that 1990 and USCET are in scheduling it this week, when AAPI women are so much on the forefront of the news. Of course, the tragedy of Michelle Go's killing, but also how that galvanized so many people to come out into Times Square, to stand up, to speak about her beyond life-size image, the tragedy that befell her as an Asian American woman, and the achievements that she had in her lifetime, which became public through the coverage of her murder. I think, that was absolutely tragic. But in this moment, it brings an AAPI woman to the front of the national conversation. But I also want to give a shout out to the other Michelle that's in the news right now, Michelle Lee, who, for those of you who are not aware, is an anchor woman in the Midwestern United States, who, in a very small offhanded side remark on New Year's Day, referenced the fact that her Korean family eats dumplings for the holiday. And this caused this backlash, a fierce, horrible backlash of a nasty viewer who said, Michelle needed to keep her Korean to herself, and she didn't need to be so very Asian. And that, for those of you who haven't heard it, I do want to encourage those of you to follow the hashtag Very Asian. It's also become a t-shirt of promotion for the Asian American Journalists Association. It's getting national attention. And once again, bringing from this really unfortunate circumstance, bringing a real triumph of her as an AAPI woman and that representation, that I think is trailblazing in its own way and really important in this moment. And I'm just so glad that we're meeting on this particular week.
Well, that's great, Joy. And we're going to come back to talking about Michelle Go and the coverage on that in a second. But I just want to turn to Weijia here and ask Weijia, I mean, what does trailblazing mean to you? You're blazing trails in all sorts of different ways, particularly, I think, because of all of us, you're born in China, and I think that became a particular sort of an issue, I think, with the coverage during the Trump years. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. First, I just want to say I'm extremely grateful, and I feel very humbled by this opportunity to even sit next to Helen and Joey, knowing that they blazed those trails for me. And so I thought, gosh, I'm not a trailblazer. I don't fit in this category. But then I think that's doing a disservice to the women after me who are sending me notes, who are 18, 19, 20 years old, saying things still like, it's so great to see someone who looks like me on TV. And I think oftentimes, and maybe not so much these days, but there was a period when we liked to think of America as being, post-racial, and that was really naive. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are far from there. And so as long as the trail still has bumps and still has challenges, we will all be trailblazers. It wasn't until this really affected me a month ago when my colleague, Nancy Chen, on CBS News was on right after me, and it was the evening news, and I did a report, and then right after me came Nancy, and we both realized, wow, what a moment. Until we can get to a point where we see that and we don't have to say what a moment, there are trails to be blazed. And so I think we are making progress. We're getting to that point. And I think it all goes back to the question of what it means to be American. And because of what we look like, I think that is a difficult question for many fellow Americans to answer when it comes to AAPI. So again, we're not just blazing the trails for fellow journalists, but really for our community to stand up together and to make the point as often and as long as we have to, that yes, we are American and we are here to stay, and we are here to grow louder and stronger as time goes on. So again, when I think about how I can reach out my hand to those younger women or men, whatever, to the next generation, when I think about what my place is, it's really bigger than what we're doing now. It's bigger than us, and we have to keep the momentum going, which is why the hashtag Very Asian movement is so important. So that this isn't just a blip. This isn't just us having a moment. This is us changing the narrative and retaking control of it and not letting go. So to that end, I think that we all take this responsibility very seriously. And I will just end by saying, when I think that I'm not a trailblazer, I look around the room in the White House press corps, and you can't help but notice that I am, I'm still very much a minority. It's still a very white-driven industry, especially among that press corps. And we're doing our parts to change that.
Well, that's great. I love to hear you ladies owning it. There's an overtone of this Asian modesty here that I'm hearing that I want us all to sort of get away from. Yes, you are trailblazers. Own it and be proud of it. I love it. Okay, let's move into where we were talking about, which Joey raised initially, which is something we really want to delve into. Part of what you do as journalists is to cover and what's very tied to it is covering Asian American hate, particularly from Vincent Chin until now, Michelle, with what's happened with Michelle Go. I want to ask, and time again, we still get that feeling that somehow when we say the media, and unfortunately we are also the media, but the media isn't somehow getting it right. There's a perception, or at least a pretty strong feeling that that when it comes to covering Asian hate crimes, there's a rush to judgment that lots of times they say, well, this wasn't an Asian hate crime. I mean, that was certainly what we saw with the Atlanta shootings last year, where there was a huge rush to say, well, it wasn't right away. And it seems to be still the case. Now, is this what you're feeling? Do you think we can be doing better? Helen,
Sure.
you want to jump in first?
Yeah, Helen.
Yeah, well, number one, sure, we can be doing a lot better, but yes, I think that this is part of a pattern. This is something that's been going on for a long time, and to Joey and Weijia's point, that this is more than about journalists and journalism. We are a reflection of society as a whole, and whether we're seen as American or not, and most commonly not, that's part of our history in this country. And so so how are hate crimes viewed, whether it's by the criminal justice system, whether it's by the cop who shows up or gives the first press conference, or in the newsroom, and we have to talk to our editors about the story and the possibility that it could be a hate crime, not saying that it is or isn't, but the possibility. That has always, even today, even this week with Michelle Elisa Go, the immediate knee-jerk response, even before a second of investigation, is that, oh no, it's not a hate crime. The day after the mass killings in Atlanta, where 6 Asian women were killed in their workplaces and sought after, the day after that happened, the press conference by the police was, oh, this has nothing to do with race or racism. And over time, as you pointed out, I was involved in the Vincent Chin case, where the killing in 1982, 40 years ago, the biggest hurdle was for our community to say, not that it is a hate crime, but wait a minute, let's look at it. Let's investigate. Do not immediately dismiss this. And that's what happened. And, I was a young journalist then, and I was not sure whether I was going to lose my job or my budding career because I knew how to write a press release, and I knew how to conduct a press conference, that I stepped in to assist the community. But I also knew how much people assumed that our communities were either not American, that we didn't exist, that we didn't speak English, that we had only just all shown up yesterday, and that we had no place in the American race dialogue. And so that was what we were fighting then. And that included dealing with reporters, many reporters who just said, this had nothing to do, it was just a barroom brawl. It was just another murder. It had nothing to do with race, even though this was a climate much like today, where it was very anti-Asian and then anti-Japan, whereas today, clearly we know it's anti-China. But it was the same idea, lumping all Asians together and dismissing it. And we don't have time for me to list the many, many, many dozens of other killings of Americans of Asian descent that were immediately thrown, the immediate response was, oh, it has nothing to do with race. They said to Vincent Chin, it's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work, and hired somebody to get the Chinese, but there wasn't a single racial slur in there. So get the Chinese is not enough of a motivation to say it has something to do with race. And those are things that we had to deal with then. And unfortunately, we have to deal with today too. So that hasn't disappeared. And when Michelle Go was killed, the immediate news coverage, it made me so sad and sick to see how immediately there was sort of almost apologetically saying that, well, he was deranged, well, he was mentally ill, well, he had a history of these things, well, he actually had scared another woman on the platform. And so therefore it had nothing to do with race. It was not a hate crime. Well, the fact is there was no investigation. We don't know that. It may very well be that it was not. But why make excuses right away and go for 2 days, 2 full days after hearing all about the killer without even knowing her name or anything about her, and that she was a loved person, that she was beloved, she was a contributing member of society and a very beautiful human being. And so it took days before we actually got that. And I think that's part of the dehumanization of Asian Americans. And we still are dealing with that. And I have to say, even in our newsrooms, and that's very sad. The work still has to be done.
Can I just add here something? You know, I hear from people sometimes, what difference does it make if you call it a hate crime or a murder, or what difference does it make? And it does. And we see this, you know, in other environments. For example, you know, we talk about the impact on other marginalized communities. Like, think about what happened in Georgia prior to the slayings, the murders of these women. The reason Georgia has a hate crime statute is because Ahmaud Arbery was gunned down in the street by people who hunted him, men who hunted and killed him. And they did it solely because they identified him as a Black man who did not belong. This is what happens when you other, right? If your system says this is an othered person, we don't need to worry about why they get killed or not. We dehumanize, and also we change the nature of crime. And if we don't understand that, that's, you know, this is that parallel across marginalized communities. If these are dismissed as not being relevant to our identities, then you know what, you have minimized the value of that human life. Is it true that people, I mean, I would argue that pretty much anyone who slaughters another human being is mentally ill at some level. But in the nature of crime, as we identify crime, a hate crime is a different thing. It does mean something different, and it means something different to the legal system and the prosecution of these crimes if you aren't willing to identify them, investigate them, and prosecute them as hate crimes.
I'm really glad that you brought up that the othering sort of things. And maybe this is a good way to sort of segue to Wei Jia, because that's actually the title of her upcoming memoir, Other. So Wei Jia, you care to comment on this particular issue and what made you decide to call your memoir Other because of this?
Well, so first, I just want to chime in on the Atlanta shootings, because I think it's a case study of 2 really important things. The first, the utter lack of education and ignorance surrounding Asian American history that leads to a misunderstanding of whether something is a hate crime or not. And number 2, the need for diversity, not only in newsrooms, but in organizations across the board, including police departments. When the shooter said that this was not motivated by race, that it was because he wanted to eliminate a sexual temptation, because there is no historical understanding of the way Asian women were sexualized and why that is in itself a form of racism, then they just accepted that. And by they, I mean the investigators, the police just accepted that as, well, he says it's because of sex. And sex does not have to do with race. And so therefore, it's not a hate crime based on race. And again, this police department, these spokespeople who were relaying this message had a lack of understanding. And perhaps had there been an Asian American police officer in the department or a detective who could say, actually, let's peel back the layers here, this is why we need further investigation, then they wouldn't so quickly have gone on national television to say this wasn't a hate crime. So I think that case resonated for so many ways, because it just highlighted something that we've been going through for so long. And the reason I called my book Others, because I didn't know that either. And I grew up in rural West Virginia. I was born in Xiamen, China. My parents immigrated. I immigrated to the US. I grew up in West Virginia, and I was very naive to think that as long as I get out of here, as long as I get out of this small town in this small state and leave and go to a big city in America, I will never have to deal with the feeling of being othered and being alone. And then, I did everything I was taught to do. I got good grades. I got a good job. I was in the White House. And then in the White House is when I really was shaken, because I realized it doesn't matter. I mean, here I am doing one of the most patriotic things you could probably do, which is work from that building every single day. And yet I still felt that way when the previous administration othered not only myself, but all AAPIs, anybody who looked vaguely Chinese, because there was such an urgency to blame the coronavirus on the Chinese. And so that's why I decided on that name, and it had more to do with my personal experience growing up in West Virginia than it did with something that we're all experiencing every day over and over. And so, but now obviously, given the context of where we are, the climate of our country, it fits in a different way. And so it's been a very emotional and draining and therapeutic process to write, but it's been very difficult too.
That's really interesting that I think probably every Asian American has that seminal moment, probably in work or something, where you sort of realize, hey, you know what? I did all the right things, but somehow I'm still going to be othered, right? And I'm kind of curious, Helen, I see you nodding your head. Joey, do you guys remember that moment or an instance where that happened to you?
I got to tell you, I didn't know I was Asian until I was maybe 22 or 25. I mean, it never really dawned on me. I grew up in I'm half Chinese and half Japanese, and I did not grow up within the Chinese community in a daily basis or in the Japanese community. And so because of the inner family dynamics of my family, I grew up in a community that is pretty close to 50-50 black, white, and then Joey. And I just didn't realize that I was Asian for a really long time. Which sounds stupid, but it didn't occur to me. And it's always been interesting to me that there have been other times in my life where I had an experience when I was an anchor at CNN where management had decided that they were going to promote me and an African-American man to co-anchor the primetime evening newscast. He's a great guy. I was very excited to work with him. And my agent said, okay, look, I love this. I love that they're going to put you together. But he went back to the management of CNN and said, do y'all understand you're putting an Asian woman next to an African-American man and having them anchor? And that's great, but have you guys thought through this? And they said, oh yeah, not only have we thought through this, we've actually tested it in audience research, and Joey is not a minority, so it's not a problem. It was the most backhanded way to look at it, but it was this, are you or are you not? What is your identity? What are you really? And then at the same time, I will say that, when I worked for CBS News, an executive at CBS News asked me if I had ever considered taking English classes, because he said he didn't like my stories. And he said, well, have you ever considered taking English classes? I know people are probably going to fall over, but a CBS News executive said that to me. I didn't know how to answer it. So it's this on again, off again. Are you on the in or are you not? And at what point does your identity come into play? Somebody asked in the chat about whether you can divorce yourself from that. You can't. You can't. I'm sorry. And then somebody in the Q&A asked that question.
Yeah.
You can't. And I think we have learned this. I think journalism schools actually also have learned this, that this notion of purely objective is a misnomer. We come with our identities, whatever that means. We come as women, we come as people of color, we come as Asians, we come as Chinese, we come as Japanese, we come with all of our identity. That should create a richer experience in journalism that we learn about more, but it doesn't always. So I definitely did not answer your question. Sorry, May.
No, I think you really added to, and just for reference to folks, there was a question, which that was posed about whether or not you should be that journalist that's the fly on the wall, that's just somebody that professional, doesn't bring in your baggage, basically. Can you be that? That's the sort of a very traditional mode of understanding of journalism, and I think that's evolved over time. I think certainly you have all observed it, and also and seen that people can be better journalists. Yes, you can be very professional and be and value judgments and all, but at the same time still bring who you are to it and make it a better experience because of it. But Helen, what about you? What was your other moment? I'm sure there must be more than one.
Well, I guess I have to say I have never not felt other in my early years. And so as I am a somewhat different generation. I grew up at a time when there were so few Asian Americans, but my parents were also immigrants from China post World War II. They were not part of the Guangdong province migration from Taishan or other places, during the gold rush. There are many 5th, 6th, 7th generation Asian Americans, but my parents were not among them. And so as a kid growing up during the Vietnam War, I mean, people, after the Korean War, but while the Vietnam War is growing up, I mean, we were seen as the enemy. I grew up outside of a couple military bases, and in New Jersey, Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base. I had many friends who were military kids, and I'd see their parents. Some of them had brothers who died in Vietnam, and there was no question that we were seen as other. And so, but here's the thing, my parents also were very proud of being Chinese. And they didn't know what it meant to be Chinese American, but they taught us and said things like, when Europeans were naked in caves, we wore silk. And now later on, knowing about history, I don't actually think that was quite true, but he taught us to be proud of who we are, but we knew we were different. And so I think, and then when we would go to a Chinatown, I also realized I was an other because my parents were from East China, the Jiangsu province area. We did not look Cantonese. And so when we went into Chinatown, I mean, I still stuck out like a sore thumb and thought, and also I didn't speak Chinese and didn't speak Cantonese. So it was more of a question, where do I fit in? Even questioning whether I am American when people were saying on the street, go back where you came from. And I would have to say, what, New Jersey? I'm here, But so I think the challenge more for me was feeling that I could be part of being at the table, that I had a right to be there too, that I grew up with hot dogs, apple pie, and baseball. And so, damn it, I belong here too. And so that was, I think, more part of the recognition that I had to do. And I think these different experiences just show that there is no monolithic Asian American or Asian American woman experience. And I mean, China's huge. The Chinese and Asian American diaspora is huge. And we all bring different experiences. And that means as journalists, no matter what background you are, we bring in our own lenses. And that's why this whole, objectivity thing of the past is really, why we need to have a diverse newsroom or society, because we all bring in our own view of things, which is colored by, our own upbringing and our own background and our own ignorance and our own lack of knowledge about other people. And that's why we need more of everybody, but definitely more Asian American and Asian American women voices.
I might argue here that, that feeling of otherness is maybe what makes you guys good journalists. I think you can't I think that's that need to be standing on the outside always that makes it you a better storyteller, a better recounter of facts, a better observer, perhaps. I mean, I would say this because I'm thinking, even when I went back to China, I really did go back to China and reported in China. I was definitely still the other there because you're not Chinese enough, you're still Western, you're a running dog because you're not serving, you're working for a Western organization. Well, there's always going to be something. But I was going to bring this conversation a little bit more to a sort of a current topical issue, which is, I noticed that, if you look at Helen's background, there's that lovely, wonderful, interesting thing at the backdrop, and that is the Beijing Games Olympic torch. Helen was a runner, was one of the bearers of the Olympic torch in 2008. And as we're coming up on the February 4th opening of the Winter Games, again, this I think maybe makes it an interesting point because clearly the U.S.-China relationship, and which is increasingly acrimonious, is one of the reasons why we see this a resurgence in a tide of anti-Asian hate. Sorry, did I say it right? Asian hate. Okay, and I'm sort of asking all of you, maybe we'll start with Wei Jia first. How do we see this playing out? Particularly, how do we as responsible journalists write and document about this? What do we see happening? Because I don't see this relationship getting cuddlier in the immediate future.
Well, actually, this was brought up also in the Q&A portion about the distinction between the CCP and Chinese people and Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. And the problem is that those lines are blurred, and it is up to people in power, it is up to journalists who are telling these stories, it is up to all of us who are having this dialogue, even with our friends and family, to understand those distinctions, which you would think, of course, people understand this, but I don't think that's true. So when, you were blaming the Chinese for the coronavirus, of course, the Trump administration meant the CCP, but they didn't say that. And so because they didn't say that, the understanding from the general public was the Chinese, everyone in China. And then because Chinese Americans are, still clumped into the Chinese because again, we've been talking about whether we're viewed as Americans or not, then we get sucked into the CCP bubble. Because people don't understand how diverse the AAPI community is, again, anybody who looks vaguely Chinese is then sucked into Chinese American, which then is swept into the Chinese and then taken all the way to CCP. And that is where the blame happens, and the scapegoating and the anger and the need to have somebody to blame, right? Because this is history repeating itself. We've seen this time and time again when there is conflict, when there is economic despair in America, there is a need to blame somebody else, a need to blame a group. And that has often in history been Chinese people, Chinese Americans. So I do worry, honestly, about the escalating tensions between these two countries because the public is not equipped to make that distinction. And if the tensions rise, if that affects the economy even more, again, there is going to be that bubbling anger where people misplace it. And because it's misplaced, innocent people, innocent Americans continue to pay the price.
Thanks, Wei Jia. I was thinking particularly in one area of coverage that kind of sparked that thought a little bit was there was news today that a MIT scientist of Chinese origin, charges were dropped against him. He had been accused of fraud, mainly for not fully disclosing his ties to a Chinese university. Now, this is part of, I think, the US-China acrimony, where transfers of technology, fears of spy, where all these things are increasingly coming to the fore. And as Weijia mentioned, sometimes a lot of innocent people are caught up in it. And I was thinking about this particularly with the MIT case because of what you wrote, Helen, with the Wen-Ho Lee case. Do you want to sort of recap a little bit about what's happened with that case since then and what relevance it has today?
Sure. Well, interestingly, we're talking about journalism too. Wen-Ho Lee was a scientist with Los Alamos National Laboratories. He was a physicist. Los Alamos, what they do is they work on nuclear bombs. And this was at a time in the 1990s where there was also a lot of anti-China rhetoric going on. And back then, even if you had an Asian name of any kind, whether it was Thai or Filipino or South Asian, people were being accused of being conduits to the People's Republic of China. I mean, it was really that gross of a net. And many people across the Pan-Asian board ended up being investigated by the FBI simply because they had Asian names and had donated money to the Democratic Party. You know, it could have been $10, but the fact that they had an Asian name, you know, so that was a time of trying to blame a lot of, you know, whatever's happening in America, the campaign finance system, on China and people who could be conduits to the PRC. And that meant there was a dragnet out there, basically looking for anybody that they could say was a Chinese spy. And unfortunately for Wen-Ho Lee, they landed on him. And, you know, it's a long story, but in any case, he was accused of being a spy. And where did this come from? It came from a rumor that was planted by, you know, people who had their own agendas and given to newspaper reporters. And something like that, hey, we found a spy. I mean, it was too tempting for the New York Times to even look into why this Taiwanese American, you know, would, at a time of intense cross-straits tension, would actually want to, you know, help the PRC drop a bomb on his family in Taiwan. But so in any case, the New York Times ran that as a front page story. And it said there is this, you know, worst case since the Rosenbergs, who, you know, back in the 50s were charged and convicted of being spies and executed. And so basically they were saying this man, Wen-Ho Lee, was worse than the Rosenbergs. And so he was tried on the cover of the New York Times. And because the New York Times ran with it, so did every other media outlet. So this man's name, his face, his address, his family was all over the media. And by the way, no charges had been drawn up yet. And so with that pressure, I mean, I remember watching on PBS NewsHour, where the head of the Department of Energy was being asked, why haven't you, the DOE, arrested this man yet? When are you going to arrest him? Well, shortly after that, they arrested him. And so this was an example of the news media carrying this through, beating the drum so hard that, you know, the political institutions responded politically, and he was arrested. He was put in prison, jailed for, put in solitary confinement for 9 months on 59 counts of different things. Some of that could have led to, life in prison or execution. And finally, he was released with an apology. In order for him to get out of jail after 9 months in solitary confinement, he pled to one count, which was the mishandling of classified information, which is a common mistake that people make. You know, the classification rules are incredibly complicated. And the head of the CIA at that point, John Deutsch, had mishandled classified information. He got a slap on the wrist, which is normally what would have happened. Wen Ho Lee went to prison, lost his reputation, lost his job. And unfortunately, to your point about the news today, and an investigation of an MIT scientist who made a technical mistake, maybe, I don't know the details of it, but these forms and all this stuff are so complex that it's very common to have a mistake. But if there is a Chinese or Chinese American or Asian American associated with that, it no longer becomes a mistake. It becomes labeled as espionage, and people go to jail. These are criminal offenses. Whereas if it were anybody else, trade secrets, for example, that is a civil matter. If it is a Chinese person, it's not a trade secret violation anymore. It becomes industrial espionage, and the FBI gets called in. And so with this so-called China initiative started by Trump and being continued under the Biden administration, there are literally hundreds of people like the MIT scientist who was, charges were dropped against him today. There have been dozens of other examples like him. But what happens in the meantime? Their reputations are completely ruined. And for the media and for politicians, it's very hard for somebody to actually stand up and say, wait a minute, let's not rush to judgment. Just because they are Chinese does not automatically make them a spy, and that's what we, when I was involved with the Wen Ho Lee case, said, I don't know whether he's a spy or not, but he deserves, the right to innocent until proven guilty. Let's give the man a fair chance. And unfortunately, even today, we're seeing with the rising US-China tensions, and I quite agree with you that I don't see this going anywhere, calming down anytime soon. I think our communities have to, be prepared for a rough ride and to stand up and to come together. The other news is that Ukraine and Russia might potentially go to war, right? And involve the US. Nobody's saying we should investigate everybody who looks like they're Russian, right? But this thing about potentially attacking or prosecuting people who are Chinese or look Chinese is, just automatic. And it's hard to counter that in a newsroom or, I'm sure, in the White House.
Well, this is a great point to go into a question that was asked, which is, what are some of the specific actions that Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and all citizens can take to reframe perceptions and advocate to change this discrimination and stereotypes? And this is a great one for, I think all of you will have some specific recommendations. So maybe who wants to start with the first one? Who wants to jump in with this?
I think it's so tricky, May, because Andrew Yang wrote an op-ed at the height of the AAPI attacks, and he wrote that we need to show how American we are. We need to wear more red, white, and blue. We need to be more patriotic. And there was a lot of backlash because, I think people feel like, why do we have to prove our Americanness more than anybody else? But at the same time, it's, the perception that we aren't as American as everyone else is the reason. But I don't know. That's such a great question because I don't know how you do that, right? I mean, I think these conversations are really important. I think having these conversations with people who are not Asian American is really important. And I think it's going to take a couple generations to have real change because there has to be a referendum on our education system. Illinois became the first state to mandate Asian American history. Others are very slowly following suit, but that's where it begins, is understanding our place in America. And I think in the meantime, this is a question I'll have to think more about because it's very challenging. Because again, like we feel like we shouldn't have to. We are American. We were born here. We immigrated here. We are American. And that should be enough, but it's not, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I was thinking that one of the things I've reflected on very hard is, I think just what's key here, I think perhaps for all of us, is allyship and not being, I think, some sort of a solidarity and not having wedges driven. It's very easy to drive that kind of a thing going. I mean, so for example, one easily split that I've seen happen was with the issue of the Harvard admissions, for example, where there was a class action lawsuit launched, to try and overturn affirmative action, and using in some cases, some very dissatisfied Asian parents about not getting into Harvard, right? And then there was a whole not your veg movement. I think also building allyships with the Black community, with our other people, solidarity and standing. I think I saw a lot of that particularly happen after the Atlanta shootings, which was very heartening. That would be my thought, basically: solidarity, allyship, not letting people sort of drive you apart. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about that was interesting, I was listening to this Clubhouse discussion soon after the Atlanta shootings, where somebody was recounting how she was Chinese American and she was dating a Japanese American guy, and his mother was feeling really unhappy about it. She's like, "What are you talking about? We're all Asian Americans." And she says, the mother was remembering a time during the Japanese American internments where a lot of Chinese people, Americans were wearing this big sign that says, "I'm not Japanese American," and so that was a wedge issue. And I think it's very important for us all to stand together and realizing that, it's very easy to divide and say, "Oh, well, I'm not that, so therefore I'm okay." But, really, no, it's not okay to do it to anyone. Maybe that's my little contribution. Joey, what do you think?
I was just thinking, one of the things that gave me great heart during the experience that Weijia had in the White House of the last administration was that journalists standing up for each other, and particularly journalists of color. There were other women journalists, Cecilia Vega and Yamiche Alcindor, who stood for Weijia, which I thought, this is really such a revolutionary moment, right? But we have to do that. We have to think, well, I don't have to stand up for her because I'm not Black, so I don't have to stand up for her. I'm not Chinese, so I don't have to stand up for her. This is that moment where we really have to look at ourselves. Who can stand for us? We all have to stand together. This allyship, the solidarity that you're talking about, this is really vital. And it's in something like standing up for a fellow White House correspondent in the face of unfair attacks by the administration, but it's also in everything. It's in what Helen's story, explaining this history. It's understanding the history. It's speaking about it. It's standing up. It's keeping these stories in the news. All the things that are happening in the Bay Area. I will once again give props to Dion Lim for continuing her coverage, local TV station, but she's got national voices talking about anti-Asian violence in the San Francisco Bay Area. Will some of those be dismissed as not hate crimes? Yes, but she's keeping that story in the forefront. And to the person who is the anonymous attendee struggling to get more editors to cover the AAPI community at work, it's hard when you're one of three. Yeah, it is hard, and you will get a lot of pushback on a lot of things. But remember, part of the reason we want to increase diversity in newsrooms is to bring those additional voices in, bring those additional stories that are going to get missed. Otherwise, yeah, you're going to get beaten up, but I got to encourage you to keep pushing to get those stories covered, even when you get like 10 no's. Maybe the 11th will be a yes. And, that is the opportunity to drive that forward.
Not to be confrontational, but, we have to hold our managers and those who are making decisions accountable too. Because if we are not going to lean into who we are, if we do buy into this idea of objectivity, we need to ask them, what are we doing here? Are we in this newsroom so you can check off a box that you have filled the quota, that you have a diverse newsroom? Or are we in this newsroom because you care about what we have to say? And I think, it is not easy. And that's why it does take solidarity with your colleagues, with your friends. But, we have to find that ability to say, when you're telling me that this doesn't deserve coverage, this is what you're saying.
And let me just add that it's not just the newsroom. The journalists are not alone. There's a community out there. Dion Lim is able to do what she does because she has great support with the Asian American community. And so maybe in the newsroom, you can't be confrontational, though I will say that sometimes confrontation is merited and okay and deserved. But maybe there's a community person out there who is willing to do that confrontation. And so it all is about standing up, speaking out, whether it's you can do it in your newsroom or being in a community where others can do that. I mean, it's something that we can all do, and I think we must do. Generations look back at the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and they said to their grandparents, "Why didn't you fight? Why did you go?" And the thing is, generations from now, people will say that to us. And the point is, back in the 1940s, the community was so much smaller. Today, there's more than 23 million Asian Americans. And to the point of solidarity, these hate crimes are happening across the board to a lot of communities. We should all be standing together and finding ways to speak up, or helping or covering stories about people speaking up. And that's how we're going to make a change. New Jersey this week also had the AAPI history in K through 12 education.
Led by a teenager, a high school student.
Right. Right. And with community mobilization. Illinois happened after 2 decades of community effort. New Jersey is following, other states, but these things only will happen when people stand up. And we know we're in for a rough ride. The geopolitics do not look good for US, China, and other Asian Americans. We know how history has played that out before, and to avoid repeating history, the only thing we really have control over is us and our communities, and being able to educate others, but also to stand up. And we have to.
That is the perfect ending for this at this time. I really want to thank all of our panelists for coming here and giving their great insights and great stories. I also want to thank USCET and 1990 for hosting this. And I also want to thank all of you for taking part in this. And just to add to that, in terms of a very concrete thing that Dan Chow, the chairman of 1990, has suggested, is maybe one way you can do something very concrete about this is to share this webinar, share this link with your friends, and talk about these things among yourselves. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.